Blood Bank Guy Essentials 015-1. Hi everyone, this is Joe Chaffin. This is Blood Bank Guy Essentials 015-1, which is unusual. I haven't done that before. This is actually an addendum to a previous podcast, Blood Bank Guy Essentials 015, that I released on July 31. Today is September 2 when I'm recording this, and I wanted to give you an update. The previous podcast, in which I discussed Zika virus extensively with Dr. Heidi Chaffin, I mentioned then that things were going to change, and it's been just a little bit over a month since then, and things have definitely changed. So I wanted to issue this podcast just as an update to the previous one, so you would have just an idea of what's going on. So here's what's new with Zika. Let's kind of take it from the beginning. Zika, as we mentioned then, is in the United States. Zika appeared to be locally transmitted in a small area in South Florida. That has proven to be true. As of a couple days ago, August 31, 2016, there were a total of 35 cases in South Florida, in Miami-Dade and Palm Beach counties, that were confirmed to be locally transmitted. Now, when we say locally transmitted, just so you're clear, that means carried from one person to another by mosquito. There are, however, many, many more cases in the United States of Zika, but all the other ones are travel related. Again, as of August 31, the CDC reports 2,687 cases of travel-associated Zika across the United States. There are several big places that have the most Zika. Florida is first. Florida has 507 cases. No, actually, New York is first. I apologize. 625 cases in New York, 507 in Florida, and then California and Texas are two big ones as well, with significantly fewer than the others. Now, as of this point, aside from those two areas in South Florida, there have not been any locally transmitted cases of Zika, at least as far as we know. Of course, as soon as I record this, we're going to find something else, but it continues to be a big deal. It does continue to be an issue that we're very concerned about, especially for pregnant women acquiring Zika, and we do have some statistics on that as well. As of August 25, there have been 624 cases of Zika in pregnant women reported to the U.S. Zika Pregnancy Registry, 971 in the U.S. territories, primarily Puerto Rico. And in those patients, sadly, there have been, again, in the continental United States, 16 live-born infants with birth defects and 5 pregnancy losses with birth defects. So very sad. And the entire medical apparatus in the United States is obviously very, very concerned about limiting the transmission of Zika. We continue to believe that Zika can be transmitted through blood transfusion. If we're being honest, we don't have 100% conclusive proof of that, but everything points to it being transmitted by transfusion. So we really believe that is the case. And so as a result, as I mentioned in the last podcast, many blood centers were looking at some investigational nucleic acid tests to test blood donors for Zika. And that's what we're going to focus on today. Again, I have to be a little bit careful. There are some things I can and can't say due to the fact that my center is one of those involved. But essentially, this test, the nucleic acid test for Zika, was implemented in many places, including the centers that collect in Florida, implemented it completely. And there were some other centers across the southern part of the United States that implemented the investigational test as well. The test does appear to be a very good test. Currently, the thought is that it is roughly in the same range of sensitivity as the nucleic acid test for West Nile virus, which is a good test. So that's all very good. And literally tens of thousands of donors have been tested, really with very few positives in the United States to this point. It continues to make sense to test for Zika in the sense of if you're just figuring out people have Zika by symptoms, it's going to be pretty challenging because 4 out of 5 people with Zika don't have any symptoms. So testing from that perspective does seem to make some sense. And again, it does appear to be a very sensitive test. Well, people were cruising along with this, and there were many places that were considering implementing the testing, especially, again, across the southern part of the United States where the mosquito is more prevalent. But things changed fairly dramatically about a week ago, on the 26th of August, a week ago today, actually. Again, this is being recorded on September 2. When the FDA issued their revised recommendations for reducing the risk of Zika virus transmission by blood and blood components. Now, that is a guidance. I made fun a little bit of the FDA before, I will admit that, for issuing some Zika things in what they called advice. But this is actually a guidance, and you can read the guidances from the FDA. You can find this on the FDA's website. You'll read things like, this is just the FDA's current thinking. It's not mandatory. It's just recommendations. But the reality is that blood centers treat this as if it were federal law. So despite what you read, blood centers do treat it that way. So here's what the guidance said, and this is what's changed everything for what we're doing in the blood industry. And I wanted you to be aware of it. First, the FDA has defined Zika as what we call a relevant transfusion-transmitted infection. Now, that may not mean a whole lot to you, and it would seem obvious that it is, but you should be aware that according to to FDA definitions, a transfusion-transmitted infection is a disease that could be fatal or life-threatening or otherwise serious that could potentially be transfusion-transmitted, and that makes sense, and Zika certainly meets that. But then a relevant transfusion-transmitted infection is one step up. A relevant transfusion-transmitted infection is one of those TTIs that has a screening test available and, in addition, may significantly affect the donor population. So FDA's definition of Zika as a relevant transfusion-transmitted infection pretty much says that it's time to start testing. And even though the test is not, quote-unquote, FDA approved, it is in investigational status, but it is considered, as I said, a good test, and all kinds of testing is already being done. So the FDA recommended in that guidance that starting fairly soon, and I'll give you more details on that in just a second, that all U.S. blood centers should test all blood donors from the United States and U.S. territories with that investigational nucleic acid test. That's option one. Or you could implement pathogen reduction technology, which, as I mentioned in the previous podcast, is really only approved in the United States for platelets and plasma right now on one particular platform. It's not approved yet for whole blood, and you can't do red cells with it. But that you could implement that pathogen reduction technology for platelets and plasma. And if the technology should become available for whole blood red cells, then you could implement that as well as an alternative to testing all the donors. Well, realistically, what that meant for most places in the United States, most blood collection centers, is that we gotta get going with the testing. The testing was required to start right away in Florida, which really wasn't relevant because the blood centers in Florida were already doing that testing. In addition to Florida, there were 11 states that were considered higher risk for Zika. So those states were required to implement that testing within 4 weeks' time. And that's a pretty short time frame. But let me tell you what the states were, and most of these are going to make sense. Alabama, Arizona, California, Georgia, Hawaii, Louisiana, Mississippi, New Mexico, New York, South Carolina, and Texas. For the most part, states across the southern part of the United States, most of those in the southeastern part of the United States, obviously Arizona and California are not. Hawaii has the mosquito extensively. New York actually has more Zika than any other part of the country. So again, that would all make sense. Those centers were recommended, quote unquote, to implement testing by September 23rd. In other words, 4 weeks from the date of the guidance. That is a fairly big challenge. Many centers are working, the centers in those states are working very hard to get that implemented. It again, will vary by place, but my guess is that most places will be able to get that done. The other states, any other states in the United States, outside of those 11 and then Florida, so 38 other states and 37 other states, I don't know, I can't do the math, and the District of Columbia, I guess it's 38 other states in the district, are required to implement by 12 weeks from the date of the guidance, which would be November 18. The changes, though, are interesting, and there are some things that we talked about in the previous podcast that I want to update you on. We mentioned a little bit some of the questions that were being asked of blood donors. Well, officially, according to the guidance, you actually don't have to ask blood donors those questions anymore about travel to Zika areas or symptoms or things like that, provided you're doing the testing. Some centers are going to choose to continue that. Some centers are not. It's up to the individual place, but it's not required or mandated in the guidance. In addition, in the guidance, it's described that if someone discloses that they have had a Zika infection, then they should be deferred for 120 days from the date of that positive test or from the end of the symptoms, whichever is longer. And that just recognizes some of the other new things that we've realized since I last did the podcast. The biggest thing being that Zika hangs around for longer than we thought. In particular, as we mentioned before, in bodily secretions such as semen, for example, but there is a longer time frame. It appears that Zika may be around than we had thought previously. Finally, I had mentioned before, Dr. Chaffin and I had talked about the fact that in the previous versions of information from the manufacturers that were doing the testing, as well as the FDA approved investigational protocols, there was a discussion that if you were going to give a product that was tested to a patient who was considered high risk, which would mean an intrauterine transfusion, a baby transfusion, or a transfusion to a pregnant mom, that clinicians should do some additional consent. And I mentioned before how that was causing consternation, just because it was hard for me to imagine that anyone would ever try to get that consent from a high risk patient. Well, that has gone away. That actually went away before the guidance was submitted, or the guidance was released, I should say. So it does not appear anymore that needs to happen, and that really makes sense. It's not like we do that in other scenarios, so it really makes sense that if you're going to say the test is good enough to test, and it is sensitive enough to test to prevent the disease, that there's really no need to do this additional consent in those areas. So that's the update. That's kind of how things have changed. Things are moving quickly, and again, I said before, the only guarantee that I have for you is that things are probably going to change again, and I may try and release another addendum to this podcast if it becomes necessary. But for now, that's where we are. Feel free to ask any questions in the comment section. I do read those. And further, if you have not signed up for the email updates, just go to the bottom of this page that you're seeing this. If you're seeing this on the Blood Bank Guy site, or go to the Blood Bank Guy site if you're not, and sign up for the email updates. I won't spam you, but I'll kind of keep you up to date on things that are going on. So that's it. One more thing. I have a tendency to tell you this every time as you go through your day. I hope that you smile, and I hope that you have fun, and above all, never ever stop learning. Thanks a lot. Catch you next time.